Batya, what's on your radar?
If I told you the US had $10 billion lying around to be spent on an important project, I'm sure that each of you could come up with something worthy. Maybe we split it up and give 10 million families $1,000 each to help with gas and groceries during this difficult time. Maybe we use it to invest in building another semiconductor fab, reshoring manufacturing, and investing in national security. Maybe you'd want to see that money go toward pay raises for nurses' aides doing sacred, backbreaking work caring for the elderly, or for hiring bonuses for teachers in public schools, or police recruitment and training, or drug rehab programs, which are prohibitively expensive. I wonder, though, how many Americans would put sending drones to Ukraine on their list? And yet, that is exactly what the US government has done. The total amount of military assistance the US has shipped to Ukraine since Russia invaded in February is now $10.6 billion. This includes the latest shipment of $775 million worth of mine resistance vehicles, drones, and new missile systems. This latest package is the 19th one we're sending. Defense officials said they are looking at ways to, quote, potentially help Ukraine retake more territory from the Russians. We will continue to consult with the Ukrainians to make sure that we are providing them what they need when they need it, a senior defense official told the Wall Street Journal on Friday. Really? What about what we need when we need it? What exactly is our national interest in helping Ukraine retake more territory from the Russians? If it were of such national interest that Crimea or the Donbas region belonged to Ukraine instead of Russia or Russia-backed separatists, surely we would have gotten involved in the conflict back when it began in 2014. That's when Russian President Vladimir Putin invaded and annexed the Crimean Peninsula, a move that a referendum found was popular among Crimeans, though the referendum was contested by the international community. Then there's the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. After the 2014 Euromaidan revolution that ousted the pro-Russia Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych, massive pro-Russia protests swept eastern Ukraine, home to many ethnic Russians. These protests escalated into a war in the Donbas, where Russia-backed separatists in Donetsk and Lugansk eventually took control and seceded from Ukraine, becoming self-declared republics with overwhelming support from the local populations, at least at the time. The separatist republics and Ukraine signed what's called the Minsk Protocol, which called for the reintegration of the Donbas into Ukraine, but with a level of autonomy. And that agreement, of course, Putin essentially erased when he recognized the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk just before invading Ukraine in February of this year. But this is a crucial point. Putin didn't recognize the Donbas as part of Russia, but rather as an independent buffer zone between Russia and Ukraine. More importantly, Putin's recognition of the separatist republics as independent was a recognition of the status quo. Donetsk and Lugansk were independent in February of this year. What exactly is the US national interest in paying $10 billion to change that status quo? I understand wanting to support our allies, but if the argument is that Putin's invasion of Ukraine was evil because of the lives lost, an argument that I wholly agree with, surely the opposite of that, the position of virtue, would have been to end the killing as soon as possible. Instead, we have chosen to prolong it, arming Ukraine to the level that it now thinks it can win this conflict and, quote, retake more territory from Russia, as the security official put it. We took away any incentive for Ukraine to come to the table and negotiate. The opposite, we signaled that we were in this fight for, quote, as long as it takes, as President Biden put it, when asked whether we would be supporting Ukraine indefinitely.
G7 leaders this week pledged to support Ukraine, quote, for as long as it takes. And I'm wondering if you would explain what that means to the American people, for as long as it takes. Does it mean indefinite support from the United States for Ukraine? Or will there come a time when you have to say to President Zelensky that the United States cannot support his country any longer? Thank you.
We are going to support Ukraine as long as it takes.
You heard the man, as long as it takes. As gas prices skyrocketed by 50%, we doubled down on prolonging a conflict that kept gas prices higher by sanctioning Russia and its oil. And if you complained, you were called a Putin stooge, shown pictures of Ukrainian casualties, and told to buy an electric car. Of course, I believe territorial sovereignty is important. I think Putin's invasion was a terrible mistake that cost many lives. But the conflict could have been ended just 2 weeks after the invasion when Putin put 3 conditions on the table for immediately withdrawing troops. Russia told Ukraine in the first week of March that it was ready to halt military operations, quote, in a moment, if Ukraine met 3 conditions. It must acknowledge Crimea as Russian territory, recognize the separatist republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, and change its constitution to enshrine neutrality, meaning that it would no longer be seeking membership in NATO. It is crucial to note that these 3 conditions were all already de facto true at the time of Putin's invasion, meaning he was willing to end the conflict just 12 days after it began in exchange for recognition of the status quo. Lest you think that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky would never accept such conditions, that same day he told ABC's John Muir that he was open to compromise on all 3. Here's that clip, which aired on March 7th.
Mr. President, I wanted to get your reaction to what the Kremlin announced just a short time ago. They called these conditions to end this war. They said you must change your constitution to give up your wishes to join NATO, that you should recognize Crimea as part of Russia, and that you recognize the independence of those 2 Russian separatist regions in the east. Are you willing to go along with all 3 of those conditions? What is your message to Vladimir Putin right now?
First, I'm ready for a dialogue. We're not ready for the capitulation because it's not me. This is about the people who elected me. Regarding NATO, I have cooled down regarding this question a long time ago. After we understood that that NATO is not prepared to accept Ukraine, the alliance is afraid of controversial things and confrontation with Russia. I never wanted to be a country which is begging something on its knees, and we are not going to be that country, and I don't want to be that president.
When the Kremlin says these 3 conditions to end the war, that you must give up on joining NATO, recognize Crimea as part of Russia, and recognize the independence of those 2 separatist regions in the east, to Vladimir Putin, who will get this message from you, you say it's a non-starter, not willing to those 3 conditions right now?
I'm talking about security guarantees. I think that items regarding temporary occupied territories and unrecognized republics that have not been recognized by anyone but Russia, these pseudo-republics, but we can discuss and find a compromise on how these territories will live on.
So what happened? Zelensky was willing to compromise. Why did nobody push him to? Why did we choose instead to send $10 billion to Ukraine, prolonging the suffering there and the high gas prices here and stealing from our own citizens for a goal that just isn't clear how it's in our national interest? I really wish I knew the answer to that. Why, as soon as we ended one forever war in Afghanistan, we had to start another one in Eastern Europe. Why Ukrainian membership in NATO is of any national interest to the US whatsoever, let alone to the tune of $10 billion. I wish someone could explain to me why the only people voting against sending billions and billions of US taxpayer dollars to fight a battle over Luhansk are MAGA folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene. I feel very sorry for the Ukrainian people, but I was elected to represent my district in Georgia, said Greene, making a lot of sense.
I feel very sorry for the Ukrainian people, but I was elected to represent my district in Georgia for the United States of America. And right now our country's in crisis. Our border is out of control. Human trafficking, fentanyl, we have inflation out of control, gas prices out of control. I mean, it's baby formula. People cannot find baby formula with such a shortage. But our Congress is going to send $40 billion to some other country if they're doing, you know what we did today? We named post offices. So no, when this Congress wants to care about America and our people and do something with our people's tax dollars for our country and do the right things, then we can talk about other countries, but it's ridiculous. As
for the anti-war left, they're still braying about Trump being a Putin plant. People have argued that for Zelensky to negotiate with Putin would be to reward Putin for his bad behavior. And I'm, of course, sympathetic to that argument from a moral point of view. But this isn't a morality play. There are civilian lives at stake. And while, let me say this again, I think Putin's invasion of Ukraine was horrifying morally and disastrous politically, thuggish and murderous behavior, there seems to me little evidence that his territorial ambitions extended beyond the eastern side of Ukraine, which has, at least since the Orange Revolution, been part of a tug of war between Russia and the US. And the question of rewarding bad behavior is really mostly applicable if the perpetrator is likely to reoffend, something that is very unlikely given how much Putin has struggled to integrate just Crimea. Not only that, but we know that massive amounts of our military aid is not even making it to the front. CBS deleted a report on the subject in response to pressure from Ukraine. But before it did, it found that of the $10 billion in aid, just a third actually made it to the front. The rest is disappearing into the hands of oligarchs, political power players, and of course, the neo-Nazi Azov battalion, which committed mass rapes, including of a mentally disabled man, and other atrocities in Donetsk in 2014. This is where your taxpayer dollars are going. Meanwhile, Europe has decided it is no longer interested in funding this conflict. Throughout July, Europe's 6 biggest countries offered Ukraine no new military commitments. Remember when President Trump said we were patsies for being the only ones funding NATO? Thanks to our military aid, Ukraine has been able to hit Russia in Sevastopol, Crimea, as well as deep behind the front line. An ammunition depot in the Belgorod region was set on fire on Thursday, and U.S. mobile rocket launchers hit Luhansk last week. Now, both Russia and Ukraine are accusing each other of planning to attack a Russian-occupied nuclear plant, Europe's largest nuclear power station. The Russians have control of the power station, but it's being manned by Ukrainians, allowing both sides to predict false flag operations. The world is on a verge of nuclear disaster, tweeted Zelensky this weekend. How long will it take the global community to respond to Russia's irresponsible actions and nuclear blackmailing? There's some irony to Zelensky's tweet. In what universe has the global community ignored Russia's invasion? Recall as well that Zelensky's first demand during the conflict was for the U.S. to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which would have turned this from a proxy U.S.-Russia war into an actual nuclear U.S.-Russia war. Most recently, the daughter of an ultranationalist known as Putin's brain, Alexandra Dugin, was killed in a car bomb outside of Moscow when a car she was in exploded and burst into flames. Ukraine is denying involvement in the attack, but Russian nationalists are demanding retribution. Maria Zakharova, Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman, said that if the attack was organized by Ukraine, it would amount to state terrorism. The escalation will no doubt come with more requests for military assistance, ones our elected officials will no doubt be eager to heed. Unlike the Europeans who seem to have tired of the situation, or at least decided that Putin is not enough of a threat to them to continue funding Ukraine's resistance to him. One can admire Zelensky for doing everything, saying anything, and posing with anyone to help his country, while also pointing out that in acquiescing to his demands, our leaders are doing the exact opposite, selling us out for a country whose interests are just not aligned with our own. If Putin wins in Ukraine, he emboldens autocrats all over the world. If Ukrainians defeat Putin, they will embolden Democrats all over the world. The stakes of this war are global, tweeted Obama's ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, who in now deleted tweets also suggested that Putin was actually worse than Hitler because Hitler didn't kill German-speaking people, apparently. 165,000 German Jews murdered by the Nazis would beg to differ. But McFaul has it backwards. What makes Zelensky's leadership impressive is his willingness to demand that Western leaders put aside their own interests for the interests of his people. And what makes our leaders cowards is their unwillingness to do the same for their citizens, which would mean saying no to Zelensky. The thing that would actually embolden Democrats all over the world would be for them to act democratically and find out what their citizens want their taxpayer dollars to be spent on. And this just isn't it. Robbie, where are you on aid to Ukraine?
No, I'm with you. Look, this war is only going to end if there is a negotiation between Zelensky and Putin, probably involving some loss of territory that frankly was not controlled by Ukraine in the first place, to Russia. That's it. This whole we're with them, whatever it takes, we'll give them whatever they need, is an attitude that will have this war go on forever. with people dying, with domestically our economy being harmed. Clearly, there's no appetite among the American people to keep doing this, which is why this is so frustrating to make it about democracy. Democracy, by the way, which Zelensky is not governing in the strict principles that one needs to adhere to be, as a Western kind of liberal government, by centralizing the media, by banning opposition figures in his own party. It confuses the stakes of what we're even fighting for, and which is something that is nothing new to our wars, where, we're in the Middle East, when we're arming, one revolutionary group against another, all with terrible records on terror and all those sorts of things. And then we don't have any control. Once we give the weapons, once we give the aid, does it always stay in the possession of the people we've armed? No. How many times do weapons have to end up? Do the stakes then change, and now our old friends are no longer our friends, and they have our weapons, or the weapons end up with someone else? So it's a situation we've been down through so many times. Look, if we could have stopped Putin from invading the country, if we could have quickly knocked Russia out of the war, that would have been one thing. Clearly, we can't. We just can't. And it's frustrating because, like you said, right, we don't want Putin to have done this. It's his fault. I place all blame on him. But we have to be realistic about the limits of U.S. power, and we're not going to start World War III over this. And in that case, got to negotiate. So I really appreciate you talking through our audience about what's going on.
Thank you, Robbie, and I'm excited to hear what's on your radar next.